Somewhere in a kitchen drawer, in an old jewelry box, or tucked into the back of a closet, there's a good chance an old watch from the 1980s has been sitting forgotten for decades. Most people look at these watches and assume they're worthless. Cheap plastic, outdated digital displays, a scratched-up dress watch that belonged to a grandparent. But here's what almost nobody realizes. The 1980s produced some of the most quietly valuable watches in the world today. Some of them were never expensive to begin with. Some were considered disposable the moment they were bought. And yet, decades later, collectors are paying hundreds, thousands, and in a few extraordinary cases, tens of thousands of dollars for watches that most people would have thrown in a donation bin without a second thought. To understand why, it helps to remember what was actually happening in the watch industry during that decade. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, cheap, accurate quartz movements from Japan had flooded the market, and traditional Swiss watchmaking was fighting for its survival in what's often called the quartz crisis. Brands responded in two very different directions. Some, like Swatch, leaned fully into cheap, mass-produced, disposable fashion watches and turned that into a cultural phenomenon. Others, like Casio and Seiko, competed by packing more clever technology into affordable digital watches than anyone thought a wristwatch needed. And a few, like Rolex, kept building traditional mechanical watches that, at the time, seemed almost old-fashioned by comparison. Nobody buying any of these watches new in the 80s was thinking about resale value. They were thinking about which one looked cool, which one was useful, or which one they could actually afford. That's exactly why so few were preserved carefully, and why the surviving originals in good condition have become so valuable today. Here are 9 watches from the 1980s that are secretly worth far more than anyone expects, and what to look for if you think you might already own one. Number 9. The first G-Shock, the Casio DW5000C. In April of 1983, Casio released a watch built around a simple but radical idea. A timepiece that could survive being dropped, crushed, and submerged without breaking. Engineers reportedly went through around 200 prototypes before landing on a design that could take a real beating, and the result became the foundation of an entire product category. This was the very first G-Shock ever made, and it was only produced for roughly 1 year before Casio moved on to updated models. Because so few were manufactured, and because these were everyday tool watches that people actually wore hard and eventually discarded, very few originals survived in good condition. Today, an authentic first-generation DW5000C can sell for anywhere between $800 and over $2,000, depending on whether it still has its original strap, caseback, and box. If you ever come across a boxy black resin Casio digital watch with a metal caseback and the number 5000 printed on the dial, it's worth a much closer look before it gets tossed aside. One quick way to check authenticity is the caseback itself, since the earliest examples carry specific stamped markings and a screw-down design that later, more common G-Shock models don't exactly replicate, and mismatched or replaced casebacks are one of the most common red flags collectors look for. Number 8. The Casio Databank Calculator Watch. Long before smartphones, Casio turned an ordinary wristwatch into a miniature computer you could wear. The Databank series, which became especially popular through the mid to late 80s, let people store phone numbers and addresses directly on their wrist using a tiny built-in keypad. At the time, it was seen as a gimmick, a nerdy novelty gadget more than a serious watch. Today, that nostalgia has turned into real demand. Working examples in clean condition are actively sought after by collectors who grew up wanting one, and by a newer generation drawn to the retro tech aesthetic. Complete sets with the original box, papers, and instruction manual can fetch several $100s, with rarer variants pushing higher. The key thing to check is whether the keypad buttons and display still function, since a non-working unit loses most of its value no matter how good it looks. It's also worth remembering that Casio produced an enormous range of databank variations throughout the decade, from simple phone number storage to more advanced versions with built-in calculators. So 2 watches that look nearly identical at a glance can carry very different values depending on the exact model number stamped on the back. Number 7. The Casio Ana-Digi Chronograph. This is one of the strangest and most overlooked designs from the decade. Instead of choosing between a traditional analog watch or a digital one, Casio combined both into a single square metal case with curved edges, mixing physical watch hands with a digital readout built into the same dial. It's a design most people would walk straight past at an estate sale without realizing what they were looking at. But collectors who specialize in vintage digital and hybrid watches have started chasing these down specifically because so few remain intact, and because the design represents a genuinely creative moment in watchmaking history that never really got repeated. Well-preserved examples, particularly ones with detailing like a leather strap rather than the standard rubber band, have sold for close to $1,300. What makes this one especially easy to miss is that, at a glance, it can look like an ordinary dress watch, and it's only when you notice the small digital window built into the lower half of the dial that the design reveals itself, which is exactly why so many have likely been sold for next to nothing at yard sales, without anyone realizing what they were holding. Number 6. The Seiko Rotocall. Long before Casio became the dominant name in digital watches, Seiko held that title, and the Rotocall was one of its crowning achievements. Released in 1982, this watch became known informally as the astronaut's watch, because so many real NASA astronauts wore it during missions, drawn to its reliability and its ability to track multiple time zones at once, a genuinely advanced feature for the era. For years, original Rotocall units sat quietly in the vintage watch market, appreciated mainly by hardcore Seiko collectors rather than the general public. That started to change. Genuine 1980s Rotocall models in working condition are increasingly difficult to find, and interest has grown further since Seiko began revisiting the design more recently, which has pushed collector demand and prices upward for the real vintage pieces, rather than any modern reissue. If a family member ever worked in aviation, engineering, or anything technical during that era, it's worth specifically asking whether they owned a Seiko digital watch from those years, since this exact model was a genuine favorite among that crowd, not just astronauts. Before we get into the next few, it's worth pausing on one pattern that shows up again and again in watch collecting. The cheaper and more disposable something was treated at the time, the more extraordinary its value becomes decades later, simply because almost nobody bothered to keep one in good shape. Nowhere is that truer than with the next 3 watches, all from the same brand, all originally sold as throwaway fashion accessories. Number 5. The Swatch Pago. This is where the story gets a little unbelievable. Swatch watches were deliberately designed and marketed as cheap, disposable fashion accessories throughout the 1980s. They cost as little as $20 to $40 new, and the entire point was that you could own several and swap them out like a piece of jewelry, throwing the old one away without guilt. That's exactly why almost nobody kept theirs. The Pago, released in 1986 as a limited edition, featured an abstract blue and green dial with a design influenced by modern art movements of the era. At the absolute peak of swatch collecting mania in the early 1990s, a rare 4-color dial version of this exact watch sold at a Christie's auction in New York for $28,000. Prices have cooled somewhat since that peak, but well-documented, authentic originals still regularly sell for hundreds to well over $1,000 today. An extraordinary return for a watch that once retailed for the price of a casual dinner out. Number 4. The Swatch Kiki Picasso. Widely considered one of the single most valuable Swatch watches ever produced. Designed by French artist Christian Chapiron, who went by the artistic name Kiki Picasso, this limited edition timepiece from the spring and summer collection was produced in a run of only 140 pieces. Of those, the majority were given away as promotional gifts rather than sold at retail, meaning only a small handful ever ended up in private hands through normal purchase. That scarcity, combined with the reputation the design built over the following decades, has pushed its estimated value to over $20,000 today. It's one of the rare, almost absurd cases in the collecting world where a piece of injection-molded plastic and quartz movement, originally sold at a mall kiosk, now outvalues an actual piece of fine gold jewelry. Number 3. The Swatch Keith Haring Breakdance Watch. In 1985, Swatch commissioned artwork from Keith Haring for a breakdancing competition the brand sponsored in New York City. The design that resulted, created by artists Marlise Schmid and Bernard Mueller, and directly inspired by Haring's poster artwork, became one of the most instantly recognizable swatch pieces of the entire decade, with its bold black and green dial set against a clashing pink and yellow background. Production was capped at under 10,000 pieces, a genuinely limited run by Swatch's standards at the time. Because the design is so tied to Haring's cultural significance as an artist, demand for it has only grown as his broader body of work has become more valuable and more widely recognized. Clean, original examples with the flexible rubber strap intact regularly sell for $2,000 or more today, and exceptional condition examples with original packaging can go considerably higher. Number 2. The Rolex Submariner Reference 16,800. When people think of valuable vintage Rolex watches, they tend to jump straight to references from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which means Rolex sports watches from the 1980s often get skipped over entirely, treated as the boring middle child of the collection. That's precisely what makes the 16,800 undervalued. Introduced right at the very end of the 70s and produced through the 80s, it was the first Submariner reference to feature a sapphire crystal instead of the older acrylic, and it introduced a quick-set date function, making it a genuine bridge between vintage and modern Rolex design. Because it sits in that overlooked middle ground, well-documented original examples currently trade in the range of $8,000 to $14,000, noticeably less than comparable earlier vintage references or current production models, while collector attention and prices have been steadily climbing as more people recognize what these watches actually represent in Rolex's history. Number 1. The Rolex Two-Tone Datejust. It doesn't have the flash or sporting pedigree of a Submariner, and Rolex produced it in genuinely enormous numbers throughout the 80s, which leads most people to assume it holds little special value at all. It's often the watch sitting quietly in a parent's or grandparent's drawer, worn for decades as an everyday piece rather than treated as a collectible. But a genuine, well-preserved two-tone steel and gold Datejust from this era, especially with a desirable dial color, a clean bezel, and its original bracelet, reliably sells in the range of $4,000 to $8,000 today, with exceptional examples carrying original box and papers pushing higher still. Two-tone models had fallen out of fashion for a stretch of years, which is part of why so many were overlooked or sold cheaply. But that taste has swung back firmly in their favor recently, lifting values across the board. Its understated everyday design is exactly why countless people have owned one for years without ever realizing what it was actually worth. So the next time you come across an old watch that's been pushed to the back of a drawer and forgotten, whether it's a scratched-up plastic Swatch, a chunky digital Casio, or a gold and steel watch that's just always been there, it might be worth taking a genuinely close look before it goes anywhere near a donation box or a trash bin. Check the caseback for model numbers. See whether the original box, papers, or manual survived somewhere in the same drawer, and if it looks even remotely promising, it costs nothing to have it looked at by a specialist before deciding what it's actually worth. In the 1980s, every single one of these was considered an ordinary, everyday object, bought without much thought and worn without much ceremony. Nobody buying a plastic Swatch off a store rack for $30 imagined it would one day be discussed in the same breath as fine jewelry. And nobody strapping on a rugged Casio built to survive a fall imagined collectors would eventually pay $2,000 just to own the very first version. Today, some of these watches are worth far more than most people would ever guess, and the only real difference between a forgotten watch heading for a donation bin and a genuine small fortune is knowing what you're actually looking at.